On December 13th, 1916, the deadliest avalanche in world history occurred and barely even made the newspaper. The White Friday Avalanche is a little-remembered event in a little-remembered front of the Great War, a testament to the power of nature, even in the face of war. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Italy came rather late among the European powers to the Great War, declaring war on Austro-Hungary in May of 1915. Italy's decision to enter the Great War on the side of the Entente was complex and is the subject of another episode of the History Guy. The effect, however, was to add to the horror of an already terrible war. The Entente had hoped that Italy's decision, done in trade for promises of territorial gains, would quickly shift the balance in the war. But instead of the hoped-for breakthroughs, the Italian front quickly bogged down into yet another static trench war, one in which another million soldiers would die. There was a difference, however, on the Italian front, something called the White War, that part of the front between the Kingdom of Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire that was in the Alps, fought at high altitudes, largely at over 6,500 feet above sea level. Encyclopedia Britannica explains that Austro-Hungarian and Italian soldiers positioned themselves on the highest peaks of the snowy Alps, using the height as an advantage against enemy combatants. Weapons and other machinery were dragged up the mountainsides. Tunnels were dug into some peaks, and forts and living quarters were built among the crags. It was an unprecedented challenge to sustain a modern war in such extreme conditions. National Geographic explained in 2014. Italian and Austro-Hungarian troops clashed at altitudes up to 12,000 feet, with temperatures as low as minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, in the Guerra Bianca, or White War, named for its wintry theater. Never before had battles been waged on such towering peaks or in such frigid conditions. Brian Mockenhaupt wrote in Smithsonian Magazine in 2014, soldiers had long manned Alpine frontiers to secure borders or march through high passes en route to invasion, but never had the mountains themselves been the battlefield, and for fighting at this scale, with fearsome weapons and physical feats that would humble many mountaineers. In sub-zero temperatures, men dug miles of tunnels and caverns through glacial ice. They strung cableways up mountainsides and stitched rock faces with rope ladders to move soldiers onto the high peaks, and then hauled up an arsenal of industrial warfare, heavy artillery and mortars, machine guns, poison gas, and flamethrowers. But war in these conditions offered more than a logistical challenge, as one Austrian officer wrote, "The mountains in winter are more dangerous than the Italians." Stefano Morsini of the University of Milan told National Geographic, "In accounts of the period, in war diaries, whether they be Austrian or Italian, we find the same stories of the terrible hardship caused by the lack of sleep, the tournaments, and the massive snowfalls. The enemy took second place. Indeed, the true adversary was nature herself." And the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts wrote in 2017, on the Italian front, the Austro-Hungarian and Italian armies faced each other on some of the harshest battlefields in history, on the summits of the southeastern Alps. Here, during a large part of the year, the fighting would cease almost completely, as a different war took place, a war against cold, ice, and snow. It was a war that many soldiers would lose. The website Medium explains, death in the First World War took many forms. Soldiers would be killed through artillery, machine gun fire, sniper shots, mined from below or bombed from above. Many others were claimed by sickness or drowned in water-filled shell holes. The fact is that soldiers died in many horrible ways. On one front in particular, death came in the form of snow and ice. In his 2009 book, White War, Life and Death on the Italian Front, author Mark Thompson writes, "For soldiers on the Alpine front, the elements were a third army, one that would kill them all, given a chance. For politicians, mountains symbolized the lofty values that justified the war. For the men fighting among them, they were a very present danger, beyond politics altogether." Michael Balby of Italy's White War Historical Society estimated that only about one-third of the 150,000 men who died on the Alpine front were victims of battle. The rest were killed by avalanches, landslides, frostbite, and illnesses caused by the extreme cold. In 1917, war correspondent Alexander Powell of the New York World opined, "On no front, not on the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, nor in the frozen Masurian marshes, nor in the blood-soaked mud of Flanders, does the fighting man lead so arduous an existence as up here on the roof of the world. In the middle of the front stood the 10,968-foot peak of Mount Marmolada, the highest point in the Dolomite Mountains, part of the Southern Alps. Thompson writes that the Dolomite Mountains, midway along the Alpine front, were not a priority for either side. He writes that the Italian Fourth Army, responsible for this sector, was not given the resources to exploit a breakthrough, even if one could be achieved. For the Italians deployed here between 1915 and 1917, he writes, the Dolomites were a terrible place, one that mocked their ambitions and their courage. For the Austro-Hungarians, the situation was even worse. The Austrian forces were spread even more thinly here than elsewhere in the mountains, Thompson writes. Parrying the Italian thrust was their only aim. Among those were men of the Austro-Hungarian mountain infantry, called Kaiserschützen, Imperial Riflemen. In December of 1916, 321 men of the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Regiment were housed in a barracks near the Grand Pas summit of Mount Marmolada. The barracks had been built in the previous summer, consisting of wooden shacks placed along rock cliffs to protect them from enemy fire. But enemy fire was not their biggest threat, and their position was precarious. The European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecast notes that fate was not on the side of those men, as the winter of 1916-17 turned out to be one of the snowiest of the century. Between November 1916 and January 1917, a rain gauge located at today's Italy-Slovenia border measured 1,432 millimeters of precipitation, about 80% of the local mean annual total. From the beginning of November, there was abundant snowfall along most of the front line. Reports by contemporaries suggest that for most of the mountainous front line, the shovel was the most important tool for soldiers and civilians alike. Avalanches came down almost daily, causing new casualties again and again. Austrian soldier Joseph Strohmeyer wrote in a letter, every day there were new victims amongst the comrades. Father Martin Metchek, a priest for the battalion, would later recall, it had begun to snow in November, which had brought down the avalanches, which had caused more victims than the war. The Guinness Book of World Records notes that the winter of 1916-17 saw the heaviest snowfall of the 20th century in the Tyrolean Alps. ECMWF acknowledges the difficulty in accurately modeling exactly how the weather worked that December. The currently available information on the weather in December 1916 is primarily based on qualitative descriptions from diaries, memoirs, and anecdotes passed down through generations. Some quantitative information can be recovered from weather stations of National Weather Services and be used to reconstruct such extreme events. However, these observations are usually limited to the bottom of valleys, where most of the population lives, and give little information on the peaks and slopes where the event took place. In addition, the war disrupted many weather stations, particularly near the front line, and caused the loss of weather registers. But using modern methods, the ECMWF was able to do a reanalysis to recreate the weather systems at the time. They surmised that atmospheric circulation was held in the shape of a blocking configuration known as the East Atlantic West Russia pattern, one of the leading modes of variability in the Eurasian sector. This configuration usually brings wet spells to the southern Alps and higher than normal temperatures in the eastern Mediterranean. The result was precipitation from the Mediterranean, massive amounts of it, and warmer air, which turns much of that to rain, increasing the weight of the snowpack. Captain Rudolf Schmidt, commander of the battalion, recognized the threat. Medium explains, the weather during the winter of 1916 in this area of central southern Europe had made for ripe avalanche conditions. Heavy snowfall, followed by unusually mild conditions in the Alps, resulted in a significant pileup of snow on top of the mountain. The barracks commanders could see that the danger was looming and that remaining at the base would become near impossible. Schmidt wrote to his superior, Field Marshal Lieutenant Ludwig Goinguger of the 60th Infantry Division, asking for permission to leave the barracks with his men. But, ECMWF notes, most of the time the higher echelon in warm offices in the valleys demanded that the troops hold their positions. Schmidt's request was denied. Medium writes that this decision would be a death sentence for hundreds of the soldiers stationed at the barracks. At 5:30 a.m. on December 13th, the massive snowpack moved. Father Metchek reported, on this particular morning, around 5:30 a.m., we heard the growling sound of an avalanche. It surprised our men in their sleep inside the huts on the slope of the Grand Pas. The cries of the injured made us realize that a drama had taken place. Nothing was left of the huts of the second company. Only a swath of raw ice showed where the avalanche had passed on its destructive way. The air pressure had turned another series of huts just off the direct path of the monster avalanche into a mass of splintered, crushed rubble that stuck from the mountains of snow mixed with lumps of ice and big rocks. We worked for 4 days, shoveling and digging, always in more danger of more avalanches. We found only broken bodies with blue faces. Of the 321 troops at the barracks, 270 were buried alive. Only 40 of the bodies could be recovered. Captain Schmidt was among the survivors, although Father Metchik reported that it took 7 hours to dig him out of his hut, which had been covered with a thick layer of pressed snow, as hard as concrete. The weight of the snow that had come down about the 1st Battalion is estimated at some 200,000 tons. But, Eric Dershmead writes in his 2012 book, The Weather Factor, How Nature Has Changed History, the enemy holding the opposing slopes was no better off. Lieutenant Tullio Minghetti of the 7th Alpine Regiment, the Italian Army's mountain infantry, wrote that it was the night of Santa Lucia, the 13th of December, and my thoughts were with my family back home. We were 13 in a lean-to hut that housed the motor for our cable lift. Suddenly I felt a terrible pressure in my ears, and I thought my head would burst. The candles went out. Next came the hellish crash, which shook the hut, and I clearly heard one anchor cable snapped. It's all over now. We're falling, was my first thought. But we didn't. I dug with my hands until they were raw, but I still managed to open a small passage. I managed to stick my head out when, to my shock, I discovered that half of our hut was missing and was dangling over a crazy angle over the abyss. Far below, where the monster avalanche had ended its devilish ride, I noticed a great mound of piled-up snow. The tomb of my company. It is unclear how the term White Friday came to be commonly used in historical references to the deadly avalanches of December 13th, 1916. The white part makes sense. Dying in an avalanche was often called White Death on the Alpine front. But December 13th, 1916 was in fact a Wednesday, not a Friday. It has often been reported that armies on either side used artillery to deliberately cause avalanches. There's no conclusive evidence that happened on White Friday, but the tactic was reportedly used sometimes on the Alpine front. There's no clear accounting of exactly how many soldiers died on the White Friday avalanches of December 13th, 1916. Published estimates go as high as 10,000, but the ECMWF argues that those numbers are almost certainly inflated. They look to later Hungarian records, which suggest that about 2,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers died. And even though there was even less accounting on the Italian side, individual accounts suggest that an equal number of Italians died as well, in addition to, quote, dozens of civilians. The Guinness Book of World Records lists the Grand Pause avalanche as the deadliest avalanche in history. They note that there have been debris flows following earthquakes that killed more people, but those are not, they say, traditional avalanches. Despite being the deadliest avalanche in history, the ECMWF notes that the event was little reported in the press. It was pushed out by political news, other war news, and it was censored by the military. Papers in the United States and United Kingdom gave a brief report. According to Austrian messages, terrible avalanches have taken place in the Carso and Tyrol, destroying telephone communications and casemates. The Austro-Hungarian soldiers are suffering great hardships from the winter. It shouldn't be a surprise that these deaths were so little remembered, given the context of the war and the nature of the White War. Malkenhaupt explains in Smithsonian Magazine that the destruction of World War I overwhelms. 9 million dead, 21 million wounded. The massive frontal assaults, the anonymous soldiers' faceless death. Against this backdrop, the mountain war in Italy was a battle of small units, of individuals. The Italian mountain war remains today one of the least known battlefields of the Great War. Today there is a museum of the Great War atop Mount Marmolada, accessible in summer by cable car. It is the highest altitude museum in Europe. The museum website writes that it gives visitors an idea of what it was like to live, fighting man and against further forces of nature, which among these high peaks is often hostile, savage, and sinister. The mountain does not like to give up its dead. The remains of many of the soldiers who died on the Alpine front in the avalanches of the winter of 1916 and 1917 were not recovered until spring. Many of those remains were never recovered. In fact, remains of men who died on the Alpine front are still often rediscovered today. But certainly the men who died on White Friday deserve to be remembered. And the avalanche deserves to be remembered as it demonstrates the power of nature. As Eric Dershmead concludes, the mountain alone decides who is to live and who is to die. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.